What do you think about Mr. Saifuddin?
Mr. Saifuddin is very handsome and sweet.
Do you like Mr. Saifuddin?
Yes, of course.
Why?
Because Mr. Saifuddin is very funny and disciplined.
Do you like Mr. Saifuddin?
Yes.
What do you think about Mr. Saifuddin?
Mr. Saifuddin is very funny.
Do you like Mr. Saifuddin?
Yes.
Why?
Because Mr. Saifuddin is very friendly.
What do you think about Mr. Saifuddin?
Yes, Mr. Saifuddin is very nice and decisive.
What do you think about Mr. Ridwan?
Mr. Ridwan is very diligent.
Do you like him?
Yes, of course.
And you, what do you think about Mr. Ridwan?
Mr. Ridwan is very religious and smart.
Good. Do you like him?
Yes.
You, what do you think about Mr. Ridwan?
Mr. Ridwan is very diligent.
Do you like Mr. Ridwan?
Yes, of course.
What do you think about Mr. Ridwan?
Mr. Ridwan is very diligent and disciplined.
Do you like him?
Yes, of course.
And you, what do you think about Mr. Ridwan?
Mr. Ridwan is very sweet and diligent.
Do you like Mr. Ridwan?
Yes, of course.
Mr. Rahul, do you like Mr. Ridwan?
Yes,
Why?
Mr. Ridwan is very disciplined and decisive.
What do you think about Mr. Hijrah?
Mr. Hijrah is very kind and jovial.
Do you like Mr. Hijrah?
Yes,
You, what do you think about Mr. Hijrah?
Mr. Hijrah is very handsome and sweet.
Do you like him?
Yes, of course.
What do you think about Mr. Hijrah?
Mr. Hijrah is very handsome and smart.
Do you like him?
Yes, of course.
What do you think about Mr. Hijrah?
Mr. Hijrah is very friendly and handsome.
Do you like him?
Yes, of course.
What do you think about Mr. Hijrah?
Mr. Hijrah is very handsome and religious.
Do you like him?
Yes, of course.
What do you think about Mr. Hijrah?
Mr. Hijrah is very good.
Do you like him?
Yes.
What do you think about Mr. Erpansa?
Mr. Erpansa is very jomblo and
You, what do you think about Mr. Erpansa?
Mr. Erpansa is very funny.
Honey. Hey, what do you think about Mr. Erpansa?
Mr. Erpansa is single.
Single? What do you think about Mr. Erpansa?
Mr. Erpansa is single.
What do you think about Mr. Erpansa?
Mr. Ridwan is very funny and calm.
Calm. What do you think about Mr. Erpansa?
Mr. Erpansa is very funny.
Hello.
Hi.
What do you think about Mr. Imtihan?
Mr. Imtihan is very funny and kind.
Okay. What do you think about Mr. Imtihan?
Mr. Imtihan is very kind.
What do you think about Mr. Imtihan?
Mr. Imtihan is very funny.
Funny?
Very funny.
What do you think about Mr. Imtihan?
Mr. Imtihan is very smart.
What do you think about Mr. Imtihan?
Mr. Imtihan makes me boring, but I like him.
What do you think about Mr. Imtihan?
Mr. Imtihan makes me boring, but he is very kind.
What do you think about Mr. Farid?
Mr. Farid is very religious.
What do you think about Mr. Farid?
Mr. Farid is very friendly.
What do you think about Mr. Farid?
Mr. Farid is very handsome and friendly.
Do you like Mr. Farid?
Yes.
Why?
Mr. Farid is very relaxed.
Relax. What do you think about Mr. Farid?
Mr. Farid is very friendly and religious.
What do you think about Mr. Farid?
Mr. Farid is very good and friendly.
What do you think about Mr. Hawasi?
Mr. Hawashi is very smart and handsome.
What do you think about Mr. Hawasi?
Mr. Hawasi is very religious and smart.
What do you think about Mr. Hawasi?
Mr. Hawashi is very religious and smart.
What do you think about Mr. Hawasi?
Mr. Hawashi is very smart and handsome.
Do you like Mr. Hawasi?
Yes,
Why?
because Mr. Hawashi is very religious and handsome.
What do you think about Mr. Hawasi?
Mr. Hawashi is very calm and handsome.
Okay. What do you think about Mr. Deden?
Mr. Deden is very cool.
What do you think about Mr. Deden?
Mr. Deden is too serious.
What do you think about Mr. Deden?
Mr. Deden too serious and cool.
What do you think about Mr. Deden?
Mr. Deden is very cool.
What do you think about Mr. Deden?
Mr. Deden is very cool.
Lagi, satu lagi, siapa?
Handsome.
What do you think about Mr. Andri?
Mr. Andri is very funny and cool.
What do you think about Mr. Andri?
Mr. Andre is very cool and very good.
What do you think about Mr. Andri?
Mr. Andre is very handsome and funny.
What do you think about Mr. Andri?
Mr. Andre is very handsome.
What do you think about Mr. Andri?
Mr. Andre is very handsome.
What do you think about Mr. Udin?
Mr. Udin is very friendly.
What do you think about Mr. Udin?
Mr. Udin is very religious and friendly.
What do you think about Mr. Udin?
Mr. Safruddin is very kind and
What do you think about Mr. Udin?
Mr. Udin is very sweet and handsome.
What do you think about Mr. Safruddin?
Mr. Safruddin is very friendly.
What do you think about Mr. Udin?
Mr. Safruddin is very calm.
What do you think about Miss Sapturi?
Miss Sapturi is very nice and beautiful.
Do you like Miss Sapturi?
Yes.
Do you like Miss Sapturi?
Yes,
Why?
because Miss Sapturi is very beautiful and smart.
What do you think about Miss Sapturi?
Miss Sapturi is very beautiful and humble.
What do you think about Miss Sapturi?
Miss Sapturi is very beautiful and calm.
What do you think about Miss Sapturi?
Miss Sapturi is very beautiful and good.
What do you think about Miss Sapturi?
Miss Sapturi is very beautiful.
What do you think about Mrs. Fatmawati?
Mrs. Fatmawati is very soft and smart.
What do you think about Mrs. Fatmawati?
Mrs. Fatmawati is very religious.
What do you think about Mrs. Fatmawati?
Mrs. Fatmawati is very religious and nice.
What do you think about Mrs. Fatmawati?
Mrs. Fatmawati is very friendly and religious.
What do you think about Mrs. Fatmawati?
Mrs. Fatmawati is very religious and calm.
What do you think about Mrs. Fatmawati?
Mrs. Fatmawati is very soft and religious.
What do you think about Mrs. Fitriana?
Mrs. Fitriana is very disciplined and good.
What do you think about Mrs. Fitriana?
Mrs. Fitriana is too serious.
What do you think about Mrs. Fitriana?
Mrs. Fitriana is smart and beautiful.
What do you think about Mrs. Fitriana?
Mrs. Fitriana is very beautiful, smart, and disciplined.
What do you think about Mrs. Fitriana?
Mrs. Fitriana is very disciplined and smart and beautiful.
What do you think about Mrs. Fitriana?
Mrs. Fitriana is very beautiful.
What do you think about Mrs. Nurul?
Mrs. Nurul is very disciplined.
What do you think about Mrs. Nurul?
Mrs. Nurul is very cool.
What do you think about Mrs. Nurul?
Mrs. Nurul is very cool and decisive.
What do you think about Mrs. Nurul?
Mrs. Nurul is very decisive.
What do you think about Mrs. Nurul?
Mrs. Nurul is very beautiful.
What do you think about Mrs. Nurul?
Mrs. Nurul is very nice and but catty.
What do you think about Mrs. Dina?
Mrs. Dina is very cool and beautiful.
What do you think about Mrs. Dina?
Mrs. Dina is very cool.
What do you think about Mrs. Dina?
Mrs. Dina is very beautiful and cool.
What do you think about Mrs. Dina?
Mrs. Dina is very cool.
What do you think about Mrs. Dina?
Mrs. Dina is very beautiful.
What do you think about Mrs. Dina?
Mrs. Dina is very decisive.
What do you think about Mrs. Min Herawati?
Mrs. Min Herawati is very smart.
What do you think about Mrs. Min Herawati?
Mrs. Min Herawati is very funny and smart.
What do you think about Mrs. Min Herawati?
Mrs. Min Herawati is very grumpy.
What do you think about Mrs. Min Herawati?
Mrs. Min Herawati is very smart and beautiful.
What do you think about Mrs. Min Herawati?
Mrs. Min Herawati is very smart and religious.
What do you think about Mrs. Min Herawati?
Mrs. Min Herawati is very funny and smart.
What do you think about Mrs. Suwarniati?
Mrs. Suwarniati is very soft.
What do you think about Mrs. Suwarniati?
Mrs. Suwarniati is very disciplined.
What do you think about Mrs. Suwarniati?
Mrs. Suwarniati is very kind.
What do you think about Mrs. Suwarniati?
Mrs. Suwarniati is too serious.
What do you think about Mrs. Suwarniati?
Mrs. Suwarniati is too serious.
What do you think about Mrs. Suwarniati?
Mrs. Suwarniati is very calm.
What do you think about Mrs. Kamala?
Mrs. Kamala is very friendly.
What do you think about Mrs. Kamala?
Mrs. Kamala is very friendly.
What do you think about Mrs. Kamala?
Mrs. Kamala is very friendly.
What do you think about Mrs. Kamala?
Mrs. Kamala is very friendly.
What do you think about Mrs. Kamala?
Mrs. Kamala is very friendly.
What do you think about Mrs. Kamala?
Mrs. Kamala is very friendly.
What do you think about Abba?
Abba is my everything.
Do you love Abba?
Yes, of course. And to all of my teachers in Islamic boarding school Ar-Rasyidi NW Penimbung, Happy Teacher's Day.